Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Stanford and Colorado crossover. So happy to be here. I'm Daniel Martinez-Krams here with Kieran Murphy, and just want to get right into it. Kickoff tomorrow in Stanford Stadium. I want to go back to last week to see which performance was more real, right? Stanford won 35 or lost 35 to 14. Colorado held on for a 48-42 win. Which one do you expect to be more predictive of what we'll see going forward?
I think that's a tough question. I think that the Colorado win is more real, so to speak, simply because I think the fact that David Mills was scratched from the roster so last minute for the Cardinal due to the positive coronavirus test. That obviously threw a massive wrench in David Shaw's plan and the Cardinals' plan from an offensive perspective versus everything actually went pretty smoothly with the Buffs versus the Bruins. Knock on wood that things remain the same, from between now and 12:30 Pacific time tomorrow. So I think that in terms of what was a sort of more indicative performance in terms of what we're likely to see down the road, should all things remain stable, which obviously sort of, we can't be sure of anything given these times. I think that we can probably rely on the Buffs' performance as a more sort of quality picture and sort of more holistic picture of what, we're likely to see coming down the road. But how about yourself?
I definitely thought from Stanford's offense, we didn't have a good idea at all. I think Jack West and Tanner McKee, the two quarterbacks that filled in, did an admirable job. They stepped in, but not providing what Davis Mills would have. The coaches were so excited about Davis Mills and those receivers, and we didn't really get to see it get off the ground. I do think, and we'll get into this a little bit later, that Stanford's rushing game, what they showed in the first game, was very real and should be expected. But at the same time, I do think what Stanford's defense showed that was really just porous was what we should expect going forward as well. Oregon, especially on the ground, tore through Stanford, and it didn't look good in the air either. I think Stanford really struggled there, and I think that should be expected. But then looking over at Colorado, the defense, I think, is going to be a team that gives up around a lot of points, right? Last year, it was around 35 points per game. That really saved them last week is the 4 turnovers, but I don't know if that's anything that has to do with the Colorado's defense necessarily, or just that UCLA was coughing up so many turnovers and DTR and just a lot of struggles there. So I don't know if Colorado can keep that up going forward. They had 11 interceptions and 6 fumble recoveries last year. They already had 1 interception and 3 fumble recoveries this year. So that's a lot to ask of anybody. But what you said earlier with Jarek Broussard, Sam Neuer, that's going to keep on rolling for Colorado. I have no reason to see that stopping, especially, as I said, Stanford's defense looks like it's going to struggle, and I see that they can have another game.
Yeah, I agree with you regarding sort of the Stanford defense, was a little bit porous, is a little bit less experienced, and they had a lot of young guys sort of forced to just kind of grow. David Shaw was sort of quoted as saying that they were there's a lot of guys on the defensive side of the ball that sort of had to grow immediately into, playing just like being fully relied upon without any kind of full summer camp. And, there is no preseason, obviously, in college football and stuff. And so there's a lot of guys who just sort of had to, there were young guys needing to fill in some spots, and they were relied upon sort of right off the bat. And so I think that obviously that's a little bit of a hindrance for Stanford. I think that on the defensive side of the ball for Colorado, we can be somewhat, we can expect to see more strong defensive play because of, between the defense and the offense for Colorado, the defense certainly has more strong returning players, particularly with Mustafa Johnson, as a very, very strong edge rusher, as well as Nate Landman, inside linebacker, who has sort of been, had that big 4th and 1 stop for Colorado that sort of ended up really sort of sealing the game for them against UCLA. And so I think that Colorado is going to rely on sort of defensive stalwarts like that. I think that while, it was really great to see Jarek Broussard and Sam Neuer have a really good game last week, the same could be said in terms of UCLA. We don't know whether they sort of just had a fluky decent offensive game, or whether their offense is actually sort of like whether their offense will continue to put up numbers like they did today or not. And so I think that it's likely that Colorado's defense is going to continue to be what honestly is more reliable to keep them in games than their offense.
Yeah, and last year I know Stanford came into that game expecting a lot from their offense going against Colorado, just because Colorado in its first 9 games had given up 30 points every single time. Stanford goes out and scores 13. So that's to say that Colorado's defense can absolutely step up at any time. And I look at Sam Neuer, and I think he had about 64 rushing yards last game. Really stood out to me just because Stanford has struggled so much with running quarterbacks going back to last year, and then even last week with Tyler Shugg just demolishing them on the ground. So that's something that I could really see continuing, because Stanford has just been so awful with that. But yeah, UCLA's defense, I don't know how much of a test they really provided, just because they've had a lot of struggle. I don't trust Chip Kelly with anything right now. So that, I don't know if that's a real bellwether for what the rest of the year could look like.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you make a good point there, right? Is that, Chip Kelly and, versus the Buffs compared to the Cardinal playing a now number 11 ranked nationally team in the Oregon Ducks. I think that that's something to take into account when we're sort of making this comparison, right? It's because Oregon's obviously proven to be a team that, should they continue to sort of have the season that they, that their ranking indicates that they could have, and that, they, displayed is potentially possible against Stanford, that if there's any Pac-12 team that makes it into the college football playoff at the end of the day, they're setting themselves up nicely to be that team, over USC, over Arizona State, probably the 2 next sort of closest teams in terms of just overall strength in the Pac-12. And so I think that that's something, we also have to consider in terms of the Stanford defense looking a little bit porous, as you mentioned, and in addition, the Colorado offense looking as strong as it did. And we could honestly be in for a much sort of closer game than Stanford's loss and Colorado's win might otherwise indicate. And I think that similar to last year, we could come right down to sort of, a last minute field goal or something like that, particularly because both of these teams are very young. And so I think that will continue to show itself a little bit in one game, really isn't experienced, so to speak, for either team to really be able to, rely upon going forward.
Yeah, that point is really huge. I think Stanford is the 4th youngest team in FBS in terms of the number of underclassmen they have. And Oregon was first, and that's what I was most looking forward to, is that I thought Stanford's defensive line could really take advantage of all the inexperience of Oregon's offensive line. They had just 6 returning starts, and I think what demoralizing a little bit is that Stanford's defensive line wasn't able to take advantage of that at all. So that's something that really stood out to me. But yeah, you're totally right with everything around the conference, that Stanford was going up against one of the better teams nationally, better teams in the conference, and it's hard to read too much into it just because of the situation there. And I want to address, they're asking us for some final score predictions. I think we can get to that later. What do you feel about that?
I think we're likely to get to it, later, toward the end of the show. But I would say that I expect to see, if I had to guess, I would expect to see a relatively low scoring game and something along the lines of, perhaps, a 17-14 win. I think that Colorado could pull it off given the game that they had last week, and given the fact that, Davis Mills returning is unlikely for tomorrow and stuff. But as you said, Jack West and Tanner McKee both, displayed a lot of strength sort of in having to just step up into that role pretty in an impromptu way. But I think that we're likely to see a lot of turnovers. I think we're likely, with these 2 young teams, I think we're likely to see a somewhat sort of sloppy game and sort of a, just like a lot of 3 and outs, a lot of defense played by both teams. And, so making it, ultimately not necessarily the most Exciting game to see from a scoring perspective, but could be exciting toward the end of the game, just because I think that those kind of things tend to even each other out in terms of it ultimately turning into a very sort of close matchup. But how about yourself?
And then absolutely on that, I see it the same way. I was brought up today by the Pac-12 that Davis Mills is going to be able to play. It was a protocol testing error on the behalf of the Pac-12, so they apologize for that. So he was held out of last week, as well as Connor Weddington, but they'll be back tomorrow. They're able to attend the run-through today, so expect both of them to be back. But even with Davis Mills back, I think the run game is going to be super important tomorrow for both teams. So I wanted to ask you next question, who has the edge in the run game? Obviously, Jarek Broussard, great game last week. Austin Jones showed some stuff. Who has the edge?
Well, so I think that Stanford's backfield really sort of showed that it's capable of, when worse comes to worse, just absolutely being able to sort of hammer defensive lines. And the offensive line for Stanford really stepped up and obviously opened up a lot of opportunities for them. I think with Colorado, it's a little bit of a more complicated question, just because we saw a phenomenal game out of Jarek Broussard. Colorado's offensive line is a very sort of experienced line. It's probably one of our more sort of experienced, position sets on the CU team overall. There's sort of more returning players, more older players sort of on the offensive line than there really are sort of in any other sort of area of the field. However, that said, Jarek Broussard is playing in his first year. He's not a freshman, but he is playing in his first year of college football due to some injuries and things like that. Sam Neuer has just really been sort of a third-string, second-string quarterback up until last year, played safety last year, and then now is back in the quarterback position, which, left a lot of sort of Buffs fans wondering what last week was even going to look like. And so it was really sort of a serendipitous surprise, at least on the part of, most Buffs fans, to see this kid who was shifted to safety by Mel Tucker to then be able to come back and play quarterback. But we saw that he did a good job, and we saw that he was able, as you mentioned earlier, to move his feet really well. I think one of the biggest questions sort of in that is whether Alex Fontenot is able to return. It's looking unlikely, according to Carl Durrell, as of his most recent press conference. And whether Levante Chenault, the younger brother of Laviska Chenault, is able to work his way into the mix and into the game. But again, he's a true freshman, sort of just with a lot of talent, but not a lot of experience, really literally no experience in college football as of yet. And so I think that it's sort of a massive question mark with some upside for Colorado, but not, I wouldn't count my chickens in terms of them being able to absolutely be sort of the dominant side of the football compared to the sort of just consistent running, offense that Stanford put on against a really, really talented really talented Oregon Ducks team last week.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Chenault was your offensive scout team player. So someone who they like a lot. He's doing things clearly, but just hasn't gotten in the game yet. I thought that was interesting. But Stanford, talked so much in the offseason about getting back to the run game, because last year they just abandoned it basically. They averaged around 100 rushing yards per game. This year they're trying to get back to it. They had such a young group of offensive linemen last year. So I think they put on an average of 20 pounds on their offensive line. They talked up that a lot. Impressive stuff. And they got the push against Oregon, and an Oregon team with a great defensive line. Thibodeau, really quality player, and they were able to get that push. But I do think Colorado is going to be able to move the rock still. I don't think rushing defense is Stanford's strength right now. And same thing with Colorado is going to give up some yards, especially Austin Jones, Nathaniel Pete. That's a really good duo, and I'm really excited to see what they kind of blossom into. Last year it was Cam Scarlett, this fifth year, getting almost all the carries. This year, Austin Jones, Nathaniel Pete, two sophomores with a lot of talent, a lot of upside. I asked Pete last week what he thought of Jones, his rushing partner. He's like, yeah, this guy can make anyone miss at all in a phone booth. And then Pete himself has ridiculous speed, went for a 73-yard rush last week. So really exciting on both sides. I think it's going to be a really fun matchup to watch, because I think both teams are really going to have to win the run game in order to win this game.
Yeah, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head a little bit there. And I think what is so interesting is that both of these teams, graduated key running backs as you said, Cam Scarlett, for us, Laviska Shenault, who sort of, played a little bit of a Christian McCaffrey sort of role, where he sort of would, play out on the wing and, from the backfield. And Alex Fontenot, who's, been out so far this season, he was sort of our other sort of most reliable sort of backfield runner. And so the fact that on both sides, there's been this sort of young backfields that have been having to sort of just grow into playing, college, like real college football, and being, heavily, not only like playing, but being heavily relied upon, because it's not like either team has some slew of really talented wide receivers that they are ready to sort of, throwing the football to. And what's also interesting about it is how, both David Shaw, Carl Durrell, are both more offensive-minded coaches than a lot of other coaches in the league. I mean, last year Colorado was playing under Mel Tucker, who is known sort of for his defensive mind, as a former defensive coordinator at Georgia and stuff like that. But now with Carl Durrell, sort of at the helm, and then having Darren Chiaverini playing sort of working the offensive coordinator for him, who he retained from Mel Tucker's staff, and he's a former CU wide receiver himself, is really, really interesting to see them sort of turn so much, to relying on the run game, and realizing that, me and Jason talked a little bit about this, not necessarily playing the most like sort of sexiest form of football, which is, the big 80-yard bombs and stuff like that, but just doing the work that gets the job done, which is just moving the chains, inch by inch, yard by yard, and first down by first down, in order to sort of get the points up that they need.
And I think it's really important in terms of what Colorado is doing towards building a program like what they had previously, that they were able to keep both of those coordinators. I think that was a huge, huge win for the program. And you've covered all of it. You got it, that this game is probably going to come down to the run game. I actually love Stanford's wide receivers. I think it's a great group, and coaches have been really high on them. That's what was expected to carry Stanford this year. But I just think if Stanford is able to dominate in the run game like they once were, Davis Mills hasn't had that much time in practice. We know he's been out for most of the week. I think that is going to have an effect just because he hasn't been there getting the reps every single day. I was more worried about the passing game before today when it was announced that Mills was going to come back. But the run game is really going to carry both teams this game no matter what. And both of these teams are going to want to rely and stop keeping possession. They're not going to want to give the ball up willy-nilly. It's going to be kind of that kind of football game. It's going to be a weird thing with no one in the stadium. It's going to be different. That's what the pandemic year is all about. But I think both of these teams are going to say, here, we have the football. We're going to control the game. Let's play it in our hands.
It's interesting because as you're mentioning how high you are on a lot of the Stanford receivers, it's a similar thing goes for a lot of the Colorado receivers. KD Nixon, as of Wednesday, was day to day, and I think KD is the kind of kid who he's been spending all. Like he's kind of become a little bit the face of Colorado football since Laviska since Laviska left and Steven Montez graduated and stuff like that. And for KD to get back, should KD get back in the lineup, and then we've got a lot of really, really talented younger receivers as well, that have sort of that we've supplemented, to add to our wide receiving core. But Sam Neuer, first year sort of starting quarterback, I don't think that Darren Chiaverini, Carl Durrell really have all the sort of faith in him to be making the most sort of thread the needle sort of passes. In addition to the fact that he that the more conservative they can play and the more that they can hold on to the football, the less the other team can have it. So in the end of the day, I think that what we could see is honestly a similar brand of football as you were sort of just describing, from both sides, both Stanford and CU, which just sort of further adds to my suspicion that we could end up with a particularly close score at the end of the day.
And that's what I really want to get to next, because the last two times these teams have met, it's gone down to the wire. It was I think a 10-6 game back a few years ago, and then last year it was a game-winning field goal by Evan Price. And both of these teams have had a lot of struggle kicking field goals this year. I think Colorado's 2 for 5, Stanford's 0 for 4. So I wanted to ask this question. It may come down to a field goal game again. It may come down to some other play, but at the end of the game, who's going to have the advantage?
I think as crazy as this is going to sound, I think I've got faith in Colorado for the following reason, which is that, as you mentioned, Evan Price was the one who kicked the winning field goal against Stanford last year, despite the fact that James Stefano, who just retired after the game last weekend, was our starting kicker both last year and this year, and actually 2 years ago as well. So Stefano was the starting kicker for that entire time, but he was sort of plagued by injuries for a lot of his career, which is why part of what he mentioned was part of his reasoning in going to Karl Dorrell and just kind of feeling like he wasn't able to sort of play at the level that his teammates were sort of expecting of him, or how he felt his teammates were expecting of him, and sort of, passing that baton to Evan Price. But Evan Price is not sort of your standard backup kicker because he's had so much experience thus far, given Stefano's injuries. So I've got to say that, especially given, Price, the way that Price has sort of proven himself previously, particularly just coincidentally with Stanford, I think that I have a lot of faith in Evan Price, but I don't know if maybe you would say that from, your perspective, that 0 for 4 last week was a matter of, a rainy night in Eugene, as can be expected up in Oregon, and whether that could look different in Stanford Stadium.
Yeah, no one expects what Jet Toner did last week to continue or ever happen again. That was the worst day of his kicking career, and no one expects it to happen again because he's been so good throughout his career. Had an injury last year that kept him out of the second half of the season, recovering from that. But he'd been good all throughout camp. He had been making field goals in the pregame from much farther than where he missed from in the game. No one thought that was going to happen. Still, though, I'm going to give the edge to Colorado at the end of the game because, one, Evan Price, and just because Colorado's been in those moments recently. Most of Stanford's team hasn't been in games that have come down to the wire and the ones that they have been in, they've lost, right? There was the one against Colorado last year, which was just unfortunate in how the defense was unable to get any stops when they needed to. Chenault had a 4th down conversion. Just everything went wrong. They had a loss to Cal at the end of the year where Chase Garbers had a run into the end zone and got the axe and all of that. And the last time Stanford was in a close game was against Oregon State last year. But that was against Oregon State, and it did come down to a game-winning field goal, and Jet Toner made it as expected because he is that kind of quality kicker. The coaches joke he's from Hawaii, so they say he has like a cool Hawaiian breeze because he's normally so calm. And that's what really surprised everyone as they were watching on TV last week, and the coaches and players as they were next to him on the sideline, is that he just seemed a little bit unnerved, right? There was the first one that he just missed. The second one, he got the laces, and then after that, he was in his head. He was in his head throughout the rest of the night, and this is a player who's rarely, if ever, in his head. And that's why I think Colorado has a chance, just because Stanford hasn't been in close games. They've lost their last 5. They haven't won in a calendar year. They haven't won in such a long time. If it comes down and it is a close game at the end, I don't think Stanford has the mental capacity, whereas Colorado has won 3 of their last 4. They've won in close games. It just seems that if Stanford can't get a big lead, Colorado has a mental edge.
So Stanford does have this stat going of the home win streak, right? I think if home opener win streak, right? Which it's I want to say it goes back something like 12 years, if I have that, and correct me if I have that number wrong. But obviously, what is a home field advantage in the age of the coronavirus, right? I mean, you guys have 427 trees in your stadium. I mean, there's that, and you didn't have to travel today, which is perhaps a legitimate advantage, but certainly it's the kind of thing where, when that game comes down to the wire, you don't have the advantage of being able to have a crowd go crazy or have, the incomparable Leland Stanford Junior University marching band go absolutely berserk as you're trying to kick a field goal last minute. Nor, is it in Boulder where sometimes the like the altitude can play with things as well. I would say that that could be an X factor that plays in Stanford's favor, just given the fact that Evan Price is used to kicking field goals, throughout camp, and then last week at like 5,300 feet. It's just just a little bit above a mile, like a little bit more than a mile above sea level. And so that's something they always talk about with the Broncos and stuff as well, that whenever teams come to town, it's like, oh, there's going to be 60-yard field goals, this, that, the other thing. And, so whether that will actually, and Evan Price grew up in Colorado, so, he's been kicking field goals in Colorado, pretty much his entire life. But, I mean, when it comes to being a college kicker, whether that slim bit of altitude actually is what's going to make the difference between you nailing a field goal when the game's on the line or, leaving it short, I don't know whether that's really going to be what ultimately is sort of the deciding factor. And so I think, to your point, I think it's possible that Evan Price might have the slight edge. But I think overall, in terms of the two teams sort of, taking this head-to-head, there's obviously some gaping holes on both sides of, the ball for both teams. And, so exploiting it's just really, I think, going to come down to more a matter of which team's able to exploit the other team more, rather than which team's, offense or defense or special teams is going to be more sort of outright dominant, just because I think you might agree that neither team has a particularly just completely dominant offense or defense, rush defense, like deep secondary, or special teams.
Yeah, I see that exactly. And the home field advantage is going to be something that we're going to have to watch for. I was walking by the stadium yesterday and I was hearing the piping crowd noise, and it's a little bit different. Also weird on a Thursday afternoon to be hearing a crowd for a game that's not happening. So it's going to be different. The one, the only, the truly incomparable Leland Stanford Junior University marching band will not be there. They have some audio apparently from some of their songs, but I don't know why anyone would want to listen to that. But Stanford is, as you said, they're able to not travel today. They have their schedule, they have their routine. That may count for something. I don't know. We'll have to wait to find out. It's going to be an interesting when it comes down to the wire, because you're not going to have the fans. You're not going to have the raucous atmosphere. It's going to be weird. Everything about this season is weird. That's why we're so excited to see what happens.
Yeah, and I think the final thing that is sort of, we're really only going to know come game time tomorrow whether this ends up being a factor or not, is as it was last week, whether there's any sort of positive COVID tests or not. Particularly, I would expect if there were to be one on either side of the of the football, I would expect it to be on the Colorado side, just because I've got to imagine that, while they're traveling, just the team and stuff like that, and they've been sort of extremely close quarters. Most of the football team tends to live on campus here in Boulder, compared to where sort of the rest of the majority of the student body lives, which is more on the west side of campus and stuff. So they have done they're in an area where they're able to be pretty secluded and stuff. But I've got to imagine that sort of just getting out of their normal routine, getting on a plane, and then staying in the hotel, whatever. You never know. With this virus, you just never know what you could come across, and what kind of curveball that could throw tomorrow. And ultimately, we haven't heard anything yet, but if we were to hear anything about that, it would likely be at game time tomorrow. That could obviously, that's sort of the great unknown with any game this season. And, as we saw it play out last weekend for the Cardinal, and we'll likely see it play out for every team sort of going forward, from here on out. And so I think it'll be really, really interesting to see, hopefully, knock on wood, that doesn't, play a factor, and that we're sort of able to see these teams sort of as full strength as possible, sort of go head to head at Stanford Stadium.
And we both want to see them at full strength. That's ideal in any situation, and unfortunate, but almost inevitable in a pandemic season that you're going to have those tests. Stanford had it last week. It ends up being basically a false positive. It was a process error. Pac-12 is going to use whatever language they want to use, but it's just unfortunate that that's how we've had to have it, and that Stanford lost their starting quarterback, a starting wide receiver for last game, didn't get a true picture of what they could have looked like against Oregon. Real quick, final score prediction.
My final score prediction, I'm going to say 13-10, and I'm going to say that Colorado manages to get the win at Stanford Stadium tomorrow, 1:30 Mountain Time, 12:30 Pacific Time. How about yourself?
I'm going to go 24-14 Stanford. I don't know. I don't trust the close game, but thank you so much for being on the show. Really, really appreciated all of your takes.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Catch Buffalo Dash next Monday at 5 Pacific. Kieran and Jason Marks will be there. If you liked me, you can watch Cardinal Dash next Tuesday at 6. King Jemison and I always have it. And then follow Dash Sports, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, at Dash Sports TV. That's where you get all the information. For Kieran Murphy, I'm Daniel Martinez-Krams. Kickoff in just 16 hours.